the Soviet Union was that big rival. I think that just shaped so many people's
Yeah, but the
lives.
thing
But
is, yeah, but the thing is, actually, in those years, um, the we had respect for the Russians, for the Soviet Union. We feared them, and so that's why we didn't cross the red lines, and that's why um, we negotiated these treaties, that really took us back from the edge of the abyss. Um, and it's just not true anymore. I think it was Alexander Mercouris was hoping that because Kellogg is old, he's 80 years old,
really,
that he would remember the Soviet Union and he would have this natural respect or whatever. But I just don't, maybe that'll come back. Maybe you'll realize that, oh, okay, we are again dealing with a real adversary. But at present time, you just don't see it.
I think maybe it's coupled with the fact that the Soviet Union, which they just equate to Russia as the adversary, and then when it collapsed, they just assume that they're now just completely weak, but they're still the adversary, and so there's this
Uh-huh.
that hatred of Russia and the Soviet Union that I don't think I can never understand because I was born after it, so I just don't have any
Right.
recollection of,
Well,
the
the
idea
thing
that
is,
Russia is
actually, I
bad.
don't. Yeah, I don't. Um, I don't remember anything like the hatred that we see now. Okay, there was fear, there was some hatred, but it was actually, I think, limited. I mean, there was a fair amount of respect for for the Soviet Union, for their accomplishments, and for their cultural strengths and so forth. Yeah, people would denounce them, especially kind of on the anti-communist right. But by and large, like among intellectuals and so on, it wasn't. There were some who actually, um, were kind of advocates for them. Far left people who were communists. But in general, you didn't find that. They were opposed to the Soviet Union. They thought that it was necessary that we have a strong military to to oppose the Soviet threat, but they respected them. I just didn't. I don't recall anything of the hatred and the contempt that you see now. Nothing like that.
Is is this hatred? Do you think it's just all manufactured hatred? It's not organic. That this was something like I never really noticed any hatred towards Russia when I was growing up as
Yeah.
a child or even in school. Really not until 2022. I felt like
Yeah.
maybe
Uh-huh.
well, I guess maybe starting with the Russia Gate, things started going
Oh yeah,
up and
most
stuff.
definitely
But
right. And
um,
I think you have to point out that Russia Gate happened because there was already a propensity to hate Russia among within the establishment. Why did Hillary Clinton and her people want to pin this all on Russia? Because they already knew that that was the boogeyman, and so they did it. Of course, yeah, it goes back. I mean, there was ever since really Putin began to kind of reestablish Russian sovereignty and began to chart an independent course, we can say. Under Yeltsin, Russia was just completely defeated and simply kind of was obeyed its master. And Putin steadily moved Russia away from that. So there was just growing. I remember in the early 2000s, there were more and more articles coming about what's going on in Russia. Actually things were getting better in Russia, but it was the Russians were becoming sovereign again. They were beginning to, develop some kind of self-respect and and their economy was improving. They were getting a handle on the oligarchs and some aspects of corruption and so on and so forth. So that starting in the 2000s, I think there were always people, apparently like the recent Jeffrey Sachs talks about this. He was there in the 90s, and he said he was trying to get aid packages to Russia, the sort that he got for, let's say, example, in Poland. When he asked for it in Poland, it was within 24 hours he'd get it. But when he'd ask for it in Russia, they wouldn't. And it was later he found out it was just that there were people who did not want Russia, people in the U.S. government that did not want Russia to recover. They wanted, they saw this as a chance to kind of destroy Russia forever. And so there were always people like that. But I think, they were powerful people, but they were a minority. But then, like, starting in the 2000s, it became this, after Putin took power, there was this increasing hatred of Russia. It was fairly limited, but it expanded. And then, of course, it was, I think, in 2008 that he gave a speech. It made it clear. That was an important turning point, because that's when NATO declared that both Ukraine and Georgia would become members of NATO, right? And it has to be pointed out. I don't know what the percentage was in Georgia, but at that time in Ukraine, only 20% of the population wanted this. So this was something just that the elites decided, and even the Europeans back then, they were against this. Merkel, I think it was it Sarkozy back then? But the French president was also against it. But the Americans insisted, twisted arms, and it went through. And it was like, starting at that point, the Russians began to sort of ring the alarm bells and began to say, we're on a very dangerous course. And then, like, the more the Russians rang the alarm bells, the more they were demonized. And then we had 2014, the coup, and then the annexation of Crimea following the referendum there, and then so it began to, what was always there and had been growing began to really accelerate. 2008, 2014, and then 2016 with or it was starting with the Russia hoax, and so it's been there for a while. It's been growing, but it's just become very intense over the last, especially I think maybe since 2014 and 2016.
Right. Well, why do you think there was this refusal to help Russia, with this aid package in the beginning? You mentioned they would give it to Poland right away, but when Russia, the idea was like, no, we got to keep Russia down. Instead of bringing Russia into the fold, like we're trying to bring everybody else in.
Yeah.
Like, Russia was open to joining NATO. I mean, just imagine how different the world would be. I don't think it's a good thing because, NATO seems to be an instrument of U.S. control.
Right. Well, I think maybe that's part of it. It's like, if Russia is such a big country, and even though that Russia was clearly a mess at that time, and couldn't pose any kind of threat or really counter U.S. power in any meaningful way, they still understood its potential. And then if you brought it into NATO, it could become a real counter. It could counterbalance U.S. influence, and I think that's something they didn't want. I think that's basically it. There are some, let's say, ancestral hatreds. There, of course, certain Ukrainians, the ultra-nationalists, and some of those people are in the U.S. government. But more often, they're Jews, who's like Blinken. Apparently, his ancestors came from Ukraine, and they have a memory of the pogroms in Ukraine, or the eastern or western Russia rather. And that was a long time ago, but they haven't forgotten. There's a sort of an ancestral hatred. That's part of it. I don't know how important that is, but that's there. But then the other thing, maybe which is more important, is the purely geopolitical one. It's just that Russia is destined always to be a major power, and we got to keep them out of Europe. That's the thinking of Western hegemonists.
So you can't bring them. We can't bring them in as a friend. They can't be part of our. They have to be an enemy. That was just this thinking. It just seems like such a stupid.
Right.
Trying to understand the source of this Russian hatred.
Yeah. Well,
is
obviously, I think it's clear that they miscalculated. They just thought that they could destroy Russia, but Russia pulled itself together and is become increasingly powerful. It's just growing in strength, economic strength, and military strength. Especially in the recent years, after the really overt attempts to destroy Russia, with the economic sanctions and then the proxy war. So they were on that course. They just thought, that's the way these people think. We see it everywhere. Iran, and China, they're actually trying to, sanction certain sectors of the Chinese economy and companies like Huawei. In the end, they fail. It actually forces, it usually backfires because, okay, the Chinese, in this case, they're forced to, develop their own technologies, and they do it. And so then, you've actually lost the advantage that you had. There was a cooperative arrangement that was beneficial to both sides, and now you've lost that. But it seems to be, it's the thinking of a hegemon. It's just that we're always going to, we can't countenance a real rival, and we just got to bring him down. And it's what we've talked about, many times. It's the exact opposite of the multipolar thinking. Say that, okay, well, we can benefit. Let's see, this is just a reality. These powers are going to rise. We had our moment, but that was a historical accident. It was not etched in stone that it was going to be forever. And I think anybody, who's really has an understanding of history will see that. But these people don't see it that way. They see it as etched in stone. We are the hegemon, and we must. This is unacceptable that these other powers should rise, and we must keep them down.
Yeah, this unipolar moment that we had, do you think it was actually beneficial for the American people? Did we see a lot of benefits for being the number one guy on top, unchallenged for a while during this unipolar moment? Just the average American, did we see a big improvement and things get a lot better for us?
Well, it was a relatively prosperous decade, the 90s were. I don't know how much that was related to the unipolar moment. I mean, when you look at it, I think we benefited from opening trade relations with China, and China did too, right? They ended up taking over a lot of manufacturing and produced all kinds of very cheap goods that kept prices down in the U.S. No, but so that was, but that actually wasn't an aspect of the unipolar moment, because that was cooperative. But it's where you find the expression of the unipolar moment really is like vis-a-vis the Middle East and Russia, even though it was just it was kind of more, it wasn't so visible. It was, again, certain elites that were making decisions to keep Russia down. But of course, our interventions in the Middle East proved disastrous. They did not help the American people at all. The Iraq War, there was first the Persian Gulf War. That really paved the way for the Iraq War. It just became it was an example of trying to solve every problem, not through diplomacy, but through military might. We decided that we could do this. This was really an important moment to us. In the past, we would have to worry about the Soviet Union, that if we try to invade a country in there, which they considered important, they could, they might intervene directly or indirectly or invade another country, to kind of offset our gain or something like that. So we really stopped and think about it. But that time, hey, our hands are free. We're going to do this. We're going to attack, Iraq. And that was, I don't think really that had any consequences one way or the other for the U.S., economic consequence for the life of the average American. But what it is, it put us on that road to future disasters, like the Iraq War after 9/11, which clearly, was very costly. In the end, there are different estimates, but we probably are talking about trillions of dollars. It did not. And if you sent everybody a bill for what that costs, I think like the average family, I can't remember what it is, but we're talking about tens of thousands of dollars. It did nothing to benefit the average American.
Yeah. Yeah, it sounds like maybe back during the times during the Cold War, time of the Soviet Union and the United States were playing kind of a game of Risk, where you're putting different pieces on the map and everybody's looking at the world map, and we got these two powers and you got to make sure that they're in balance and in check. And then with the collapse of the Soviet Union, basically one player exited the game. And then the U.S. is like, great, now we can just move our pieces all over the board.
Right.
And now Russia's come back, and we're like, whoa, we got to keep on putting. And Russia's like, we're not even playing this game. Stop. We're playing solitaire over here. Everybody's playing solitaire, and the U.S. is trying to play Risk while everybody's playing their own, a different game. It's almost like that's what's happening. And so we have that mindset that we got to win the game of Risk when the world's not playing that game anymore. But we're still thinking that we have to play that game and we got to capture all the places on the board. Do you think that's a good analogy?
I think that's a fair analogy. I think that works.
Okay, good. I just needed that approval from you, Dad.